Hi guys, and welcome to the final lesson of our population topic. Today we're not going to do any new content. This is going to be focusing in on some revision. So the same applies as always. This is going to be a bit of a recap of the unit so far. So you have to watch the video as normal, but at the end, the activities that you need to do are slightly different to the ones that you're normally doing with the review questions. With that in mind, I will explain it as we go along the video. So we've been looking at this term population now for this entire half term, and we've been looking at it mainly through the lens of China. So just to go back to the very start, population is the amount of people living in a certain area. It can be measured in lots of different ways. We can measure it as the world population, which is about 7 billion. We can make as a population of a country, a county, a city, or even a suburb, so a more rural city area as well. So, for example, if you're living in St Helens at the moment, your population will be about 147,000. Where I am in Liverpool, the population might be close to 450,000. On a world level, obviously, that's much higher as well. It's the number of people living in a certain area. And the entire point of this topic is all to do with the idea that the world's population has been and continues to grow dramatically. So if we go back to 1960, the population of the world was about 3 billion people, and that's 50 years ago. Nowadays, we are over 7 billion, approaching 8 billion people on our planet. So the world's population has more than doubled in the last 50 years. And as we know already, that has had some pretty huge implications for the world. And we've been looking at it specifically with China. But on a global level, the lessons we've learned from China would also apply to lots of other countries like India, like Indonesia, etc. as well. So the lessons we learn from this are applicable to other countries as well. And in China in particular, we can see that the country had what we call a population explosion. So in China, the population was always very high, in about the 400 millions, until something happened and it ended up being now 1.132 billion, or even higher actually from the year 2000. And essentially, what happened in China was this pattern here happened on a much faster scale. So their population increased dramatically. And there were three reasons why we talked about that population increasing. The first reason, the communist flag, was because of the policies of the former communist leader Chairman Mao. Now, Chairman Mao and his cult of ideology basically suggested that it was the best interest of China to have big families, and so lots of people in China who really supported him as their leader started having really big families. And the average woman in China, in sort of the 1960s and 50s when this was happening, had about 6 or 7 children per family. So the population started to shoot up dramatically. The second reason, which is why I put the money figure there, that's the Chinese symbol, is because as China economically developed, people started to be wealthier, and as they got wealthier, they decided that they were able to have more children, and having more children again it led to population increase. And then the final and perhaps most important one is that little hospital logo there. That's the argument that as healthcare improves, population increases. So if we go back 100 years in China, there might have been a high infant mortality, so people dying before their first birthday. There might have been a low life expectancy because diseases might end up killing people. However, in China nowadays, the healthcare is much improved, and therefore there is less infant mortality, and there is also a longer life expectancy. So as people are living longer and people are still being born, the population does continue to increase. But the next question we then had was, well, where do these people live? And the answer is mainly urban area. So urban area being that built up city landscape as opposed to rural, which is our more traditional countryside setting. Now, when it comes to this, urbanization is the process in which people move from the countryside into the city. And we looked at this in the lens of China again, because in China, as their population increased, urbanization also took part at a very high rate. So the number of people living in China's urban area surpassed that of the rural in the early 90s, and will continue to increase in the future. And that's because of a numerous of different push and pull factors. If you remember, a push factor was something that was physically pushing somebody away from a location. So, like maybe the village was flooded, maybe there was no education. And a pull factor was that draw of the the urban population. And so it's things like, better paying jobs in Shanghai, or better nightlife, or better activities for people to do. And so all that led to this great migration in China, of people moving from rural to specifically urban areas. So, with that in mind, because of that rapid urbanization around the world, we've had the emergence of something called a mega city. Now, a mega city is a city that has 10 million people or more living in it. So they are very, very large cities. And if you recall, we looked at Asia being the area of the world that has the most megacities. China alone currently has 5 different megacities. Now, for some context, the entirety of Europe has about 5, depending on your estimates. Okay, so megacity has 10 million people or more living in it. And they have really occurred because of this process of urbanization. Because over time, as a country developed, lots and lots of people have migrated from rural to urban regions. And as they've done that, the cities have grown, expanded outwards. Now, we looked at some of the positive and negatives of that. For a rural area, obviously that can be good because they get something called a remittance, and money being sent home by migrants might improve the economy of the rural area. But it also upsets the population structure. So it also ends up with the people being left in the rural areas often non-economically active. So they might be old, they might be too young, and therefore the economy suffers, and therefore the local population suffers as well. Whereas for the urban areas, it increases cultural wealth, and there are more people able to work the growing number of jobs in cities. But the problems with that is that it does put a lot of pressure on places to live. So the housing, how do you house that many people if they're moving to the city? And also, how do you cope with the pressure that puts on education and healthcare? So if you've got double the number of people needing to go to the hospital, double the number of people needing to go to the school because of urbanisation, it might end up being that they can't cope in the short term, particularly anyway. And all this urbanization has really led to some environmental problems. So we looked at the Pearl River Delta, which is that region in China that's got the majority of China's manufacturing industry. And I told you that they were having environmental problems because of that manufacturing industry, the factories, and also because as the average Chinese person gets wealthier, the car ownership has increased quite dramatically. And that leads to some real big problems. So, firstly, we looked at that idea of air pollution. Now, air pollution, we particularly looked at that PM2.5, that particle that is small enough to enter one's bloodstream, and it causes, in particular, lung cancer as well. And because of the vast air pollution, because of all the pollution from the cars and all the factories in that Pearl Delta region, it has led to some severe health problems. So, China has the highest number of air pollution related deaths in the world. They have one of the highest cancer rates as well. And it's all because of this air pollution. But it wasn't just the air that was being polluted, it was the water as well. So, alongside all the factories, they release a lot of toxic heavy metals like lead and mercury into the local rivers, which can kill wildlife and can also cause human health problems as well. And then finally, it was also acid rain as well. We looked at that city Guangzhou, and I told you that acid rain was where the sort of fossil fuels exhaust from cars and factories mixes in the atmosphere and causes the rain or the precipitation to be slightly acidic. Now remember, it doesn't literally melt people, but what it does is it can cause harm to wildlife, it can cause fish to die, it can cause damage to like public buildings and statues. And so it doesn't have a huge impact, but obviously if it upsets the ecosystem, it might upset the amount of food a place could get, it might upset how good the quality of life of someone living there would be as well. And then the final lesson of this unit was we were looking at something called the one child policy. Now, because of all the reasons I've just stated in this video, China had a very big problem with its overpopulation. And so the government introduced a scheme to try and solve that problem. That scheme was the one child policy. Now, as we know from the lesson, the one-child policy was designed so that it could support its large population with good healthcare, good education, and most importantly, food. And overall, its aim was to try and improve the quality of life of its people. But in reality, it ended up being a very, very controversial policy because it ended up with a high rate of abortions that were forced upon women. A lot of girls, in particular, were either killed or left in orphanages. And as a result, there were severe human rights issues. And nowadays, China is kind of seeing the problems of this. So, up to a third of its population will now be over 60 because they reduced the number of kids being born, but everyone else grew older. There is now a much greater strain on things like healthcare, on things like caring for the elderly, and that's going to have a big problem in China in the future because who's going to look after them, for example? And secondly, China has always relied on its large workforce for economic expansion. It relies on that workforce to man the factories with places like Foxconn, the workers that make the iPhone. And what's happened is nowadays they're actually struggling because their workforce is reducing in size. So because they've got rid of all those young people that we used to be having, there's less people now taking up the jobs. And if that continues, it will impact China in the long term in a negative way. So to finish off then, guys, your task for this week is a bit different. Firstly, you'd have been set a multiple choice quiz. It's really important that you have a go at that quiz. It's about 10 questions long. Now, the quiz itself isn't particularly long. It will only take you 10 minutes. I need to be clear here. I want you to make sure you read each question individually and make sure you really come up with which answer you think is best. Please don't just guess it. It'll be obvious if you've done that. Secondly, what I'd like to do is, once you've done that quiz, I want you to create a revision mind map for population. I want you to include about 10 or 15 pieces of information on it. You can use this video, you can use the PowerPoint I'll upload as well during the lesson. And essentially, all I want to do is produce a small revision mind map for population, and that will give you that kind of depth understanding, which will then help you for when we come back after lockdown.